I had barely made it back from the clinic, my body still numb from the anesthesia, when I found the manila envelope sitting on my welcome mat. Inside, there was only a single medical report. On the back, written in a hand that looked frighteningly identical to my own, was a jagged note. Do not keep this baby. He will be born with a severe heart defect. He will tear you and Wright apart until there is nothing left but hatred. The next morning, my hand trembling, I signed the consent form to terminate the pregnancy. When Wright finally stormed into the hospital lobby, the nurse was handing me my discharge papers. He snatched the sheet from my hand, his knuckles turning white, his eyes wild as he demanded to know if I had lost my mind. I didn't say a word. I didn't explain. 3 days later, at the after-party celebrating Lacey's opening night, I stood in the shadows of the restaurant restroom and heard her laugh. She actually fell for it, she boasted to one of her friends. I told you Naomi looks smart, but she's the easiest person in the world to fool. Aren't you afraid she'll trace it back to you? Her friend whispered. Lacey's voice dropped, thick with a smugness she couldn't hide. Why would I be? I hired someone to forge her handwriting, and the medical lab report was aged to look real. Even if Wright finds out, he'll just think of it as one of my silly little pranks. Then Wright's deep voice drifted in from the hallway outside. Don't let there be a next time. He wasn't angry. He was scolding her the way one might scold a petulant child. Lacey immediately squealed with delight. See, I told you Wright would never actually stay mad at me. Standing inside the bathroom stall, I stared down at the small square of surgical tape on the inside of my wrist and let out a quiet, hollow laugh. Of course I knew the envelope was a setup. And I knew my baby was perfectly healthy. I signed those papers because I was a ghost. I had died, and by some cruel miracle, I had just woken up 10 years in the past. In the private dining room, Lacey was perched on the arm of Wright's chair, spearing a strawberry from her cake and holding it to his lips. Around the table, their friends laughed and egged them on. Wright looked up, his eyes catching mine as I walked in. His glass froze halfway to his mouth. Naomi? I told you to stay home and rest. Someone muted the overhead music. Lacey stood up, breezing past the awkward silence to catch my arm like a concerned sister. Oh my God, Naomi, you look so pale. You just had surgery. You shouldn't be on your feet. Here, take my seat. I didn't take the seat. I raised my hand and slapped her across the face. The sharp, echoing crack instantly killed whatever warmth was left in the room. Lacey clutched her cheek, tears welling in her eyes with practiced ease. Naomi, what did I do wrong this time? Wright moved instantly, pulling her behind him, his voice low and vibrating with fury. Apologize, Naomi. Now. I threw the manila envelope onto the center of the table. She forged a lab report to trick me into getting an abortion. Right, she killed our baby. Lacey shook her head violently, sobbing. I didn't mean it like that. It was just a joke, a stupid prank. I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. At the far end of the table, someone murmured under their breath. Who the hell pranks someone about a pregnancy? Wright shot a warning glare across the room, and the table fell dead silent again. When he turned back to me, there wasn't a trace of sympathy in his eyes. Lacey was acting childish, yes. But you're an adult, Naomi. You mean to tell me you didn't think to get a second opinion before signing those papers? I looked at him, my voice flat. So it's my fault? Wright looked away, his jaw tight. I'm hurting too. We lost a child. But you can't just dump all the blame on Lacey. I reached down, picked up a glass of cranberry juice from the table, and poured it directly over the front of Lacey's white silk dress. Then let me take responsibility for this first, I said. Lacey shrieked, backing away as the red liquid seeped into the fabric like blood. My gaze locked onto the silver magnolia brooch pinned to her collar, and the last traces of my smile faded. Wright had given me that brooch for my 18th birthday. He had whispered in my ear that the magnolia was a symbol meant only for me. But in my previous life, during the 10 years that followed, Lacey wore it in every family photo we ever took. Wright's hand struck my face before I could react. My cheek went numb, and within seconds, the copper taste of blood filled my mouth. He gathered Lacey into his arms, shielding her. You're a disappointment, Naomi. You've lost your mind. I bent down, picked up the scattered pieces of the fake lab report, and folded them neatly one by one. Right, I said, looking him dead in the eye. From this moment on we are even. I owe you nothing. He frowned, a flicker of unease crossing his face. What is that supposed to mean? I didn't give him an answer. I left the venue and drove straight to the studio of the Evergreen Dance Company. Lacey was scheduled to headline their national showcase next month as a rising star. Her official bio was painted in glowing, tragic strokes. The daughter of a fallen firefighter, raised with gil and resilience by her late father's close friends, the Carter family. I took out a folder of printouts. There was a photo of her sitting intimately on Wright's lap, a screenshot of the text she sent to get the forged lab report, and the original receipt for the silver magnolia brooch. I pinned them all directly onto the dance company's central bulletin board. Lacey came rushing out of the rehearsal room, her ballet flats slapping against the hardwood floor. Naomi, are you trying to destroy my life? I pressed the final pin into the corner of Wright's receipt, smoothing the paper down. You weren't afraid of destroying an unborn child. Why are you so terrified of a piece of paper? Other dancers began to gather around, whispering as they read the papers. Lacey fell to her knees, gasping for air between her sobs. I'm not a homewrecker. Wright and I. It's not what you think. One of the male leads crossed his arms, frowning at the photo. Then why are you sitting on her husband's lap, Lacey? Lacey bit her lip so hard it nearly bled. When she saw Wright push through the studio doors, she threw herself into his arms. Wright, she's trying to ruin me. Wright immediately pulled her behind his back, his face hard as he pulled out his phone to call the police. This is public defamation, Naomi. She is the daughter of a fallen hero, and you are spreading malicious, fabricated lies. You used to work for the district attorney's office. You of all people should know the legal consequences of this. I nodded slowly. Ido. I spent that night in an interrogation room at the local precinct. By the next morning, both of our families had arrived. My mother threw a folded document onto the table in front of me. A formal notice of my termination from the law firm where I had been working. They let you go, Naomi, she said, her voice shaking with shame. Are you happy now? My father slammed his hand on the table. Lacey is our daughter too. She grew up without her biological parents. And you choose to rip open her old wounds like this? What is wrong with you? Wright sat across from me, his cuffs still smudged with Lacey's foundation. If you issue a public apology, he said quietly, I won't press charges. I looked at the three of them. And what about my baby? No one spoke. My mother waved her hand dismissively. You can have other children, Naomi. But Lacey only gets one shot at this showcase. I picked up my termination letter, folded it carefully, and slid it into my purse. Then let's hope she doesn't slip on stage. My father pointed toward the exit. Go home and think about what you've done. Don't bother coming back until you're ready to get on your knees and beg Lacey for forgiveness. As I walked to the door, I heard Lacey's soft whimpers behind me. Dad, Mom, please don't be mad at Naomi. I've already lost my real parents. I don't want to lose my sister too. Wright rubbed her shoulder, his voice soothing. She'll regret this, Lacey. I opened the door and walked out into the cold morning air. I had regretted it, in that other life. I had regretted keeping quiet to protect the family name. I had regretted letting Wright hold his old sacrifices over my head. I had regretted cleaning up Lacey's messes, year after year, until there was nothing left of me. In that life, I had ended up as a detective in a bleak border town. On a freezing rainy night, I had responded to a security call at a luxury resort, only to find Wright, Lacey, and their 3 beautiful children vacationing there. Lacey had looked at my silver police badge and laughed. Still playing cop, Naomi? She had said, loud enough for the hotel staff to hear. Sounds exhausting. If I were you, I'd have settled down a long time ago. Later that same night, I managed to rescue a kidnapped young girl from an abandoned warehouse. But I got trapped inside when the place was set ablaze. As the smoke filled my lungs and the fire closed in, I stared at the last text message on my phone. It was from Wright. Lacey says she wants to see you. Can we just put the past behind us? We couldn't. Some debts could never be settled with a text. If the universe had dragged me back to this moment, it wasn't so I could suffer in silence all over again. When Wright returned to our apartment that evening, Lacey was right behind him, dragging a pastel pink suitcase. She stood at the threshold, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes. Naomi, the company asked me to take a temporary leave. I didn't have anywhere else to go, and Wright said I could stay here for a few days. I didn't answer. I was busy packing away the things I had bought for the nursery, the tiny onesies, the little socks, and the wooden rattle Wright had picked out himself. I tossed the rattle into a black garbage bag. Wright reached out, stopping my hand. What are you doing? Throwing it out. I bought that for our baby. I looked up at him, my eyes cold. Oh, you remember? His grip loosened, and his hand fell away. Lacey stood by his side, her voice barely a whisper. Naomi, please don't be angry with Wright. He hasn't slept in days. I pulled the drawstring tight on the trash bag. As long as you're sleeping fine, Lacey, that's all that matters. Her face went pale. Wright scowled. Naomi, is it really necessary to be this hostile? I pointed toward the guest bedroom. She can stay there, but the lock has been changed, and there is nothing of hers left in that room. Lacey blinked, startled. What do you mean? Where are my old trophies? My high school yearbooks? Donated. Refusing to believe me, she pushed past me and threw open the guest room closet. It was completely empty. Nothing remained but a bare mattress on the bed frame. Wright's face darkened. Those were her childhood memories, Naomi. I tossed a set of keys onto the coffee table. Why should her childhood memories occupy space in my marital home? Lacey leaned against the doorframe, tears spilling onto the hardwood floor. I know you hate me, Naomi. You can yell at me, you can hit me, But how could you throw away the photos of my parents? I looked at her, unblinking. I didn't throw away the photos of your biological parents. She froze. I threw away the fake scrapbook my parents made to help you play house. I continued. Naomi. Wright snapped. I unlocked my phone and held the screen up to his face. Here is the number for the local recycling center. If you want them back, you can go dig through the bins yourself. Lacey screamed, lunging forward to grab my phone. I stepped aside. She lost her footing, crashing hard onto the floor, her knees hitting the wood with a sickening thud. Wright dropped to his knees to pull her up. Naomi, what the hell is wrong with you? I squatted down to retie the garbage bag. I learned from the best. The doorbell rang. The building manager was standing in the hallway, flanked by 2 security guards. Excuse me, Mrs. Carter, but we received a noise complaint from the neighbors downstairs. They reported shouting and glass breaking. Lacey scrambled toward them like they were her savior. Oh, thank God. Please, you have to help us. My sister is having a nervous breakdown. She just had major surgery, and she's not in her right mind. The manager glanced at me, then turned to Wright. Mr. Carter, do we need to call an ambulance? Or perhaps her doctor? Wright stayed silent, letting the implication hang in the air. That was always his favorite weapon. He loved painting my anger as hysteria, and my retaliation as sickness. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up my medical records. We don't need a hospital. But you might want to call the police. The building manager blinked. Excuse me. I handed him the folder. I was coerced into a medical procedure using forged documents. Mr. Carter and Miss Carter here just admitted to their involvement inside my apartment. I believe you heard them. One of the younger guards looked up, his eyes widening. Wright's face went pale. I didn't admit to anything. Lacey cried out, her voice cracking. I didn't say a word. I pointed to the small, blinking light of a newly installed security camera in the corner of the ceiling. The camera records audio. Lacey spun around to look at Wright, panic rising in her eyes. Wright stared at me as if he were looking at a stranger. You put cameras in our home to spy on us? I dragged the heavy black trash bag to the front door. To catch thieves. Lacey sobbed hysterically. Wright, I can't stay here. Let's go. Wright helped her up, guiding her past the security guards. Before he walked out, he turned back to me, his voice dripping with venom. You're going to beg her to come back, Naomi. I slammed the door in his face. The second the latch clicked, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number. Ms. Carter, the files for the cold case have been secured. Are we starting tonight? I deleted the message. Not yet. It wasn't time. The next afternoon, my mother brought Lacey back to my parents' house. The living room was packed with relatives when I walked in. Before I could even take off my coat, my aunt slammed her teacup onto the saucer. Naomi, look at your sister. She's practically skin and bones, and you're still carrying on with this ridiculous feud? Lacey was wearing a high-collared knit sweater. The slap mark on her cheek had faded, but a fresh piece of sterile gauze was taped to her neck. She tilted her head, making sure everyone saw the bandage. I'm fine, auntie. Really? My mother clutched Lacey's hand, tears spilling instantly. Lacey was so distraught last night, she almost did something reckless. Naomi, are you trying to drive her to the edge? My father slid a printed document across the coffee table toward me. Sign this. We're going to post it online. It says you suffered a temporary emotional breakdown due to the miscarriage and misconstrued the situation between Lacey and Wright. I scanned the page. It was beautifully drafted. It painted Lacey as an innocent victim of a grieving sister's paranoia, and Wright as a devoted, long-suffering husband standing by his troubled wife. Who wrote this? I asked. Lacey looked up, her eyes wide and pleading. Wright had his legal team draft it. Naomi, if you just post this, the dance company will let me back into the showcase. Your sister's entire career shouldn't be ruined because of your temper, my father grunted. I picked up the pen. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. But instead of signing, I wrote 3 words across the signature line in thick, black ink. Go to hell. My aunt threw her hands up. What is wrong with this girl? Why are you so stubborn? I ignored her, locking eyes with my father. Dad, when you adopted Lacey, you told everyone it was because her father saved your life. Right. My father's face hardened. Why are you bringing up the past now? I want to hear her say it, I replied, turning to Lacey. Lacey lowered her head, sniffing. My father died in the line of duty to save Uncle Thomas. I nodded slowly. And you claim he was a firefighter? My mother stood up abruptly. Naomi, that is enough. Shut your mouth. Lacey clutched a crumpled tissue in her fist. Are you really going to insult my dead father now, Naomi? I didn't push it further. In my previous life, I had spent years digging into her background. Her heroic father was never a firefighter. He was a low-level smuggler, a middleman in a child trafficking ring who had died fleeing from the police. The Carter family had adopted Lacey because my mother was soft-hearted, and because my father needed to cover up a critical, career-ending mistake he had made during that investigation. But if I exposed them now without hard evidence, they would only use it to lock me away in a psych ward. I tore the apology letter in half. If you want me to apologize, fine. Have Wright hand over his phone records from the day of my surgery, and have Lacey bring the man who forged my medical report to this house. The color drained from Lacey's face. My father roared, "You're going to cross-examine your own family now?" I stood up, brushing off my coat. Real family doesn't murder my baby. The front door opened, and Wright stepped in. He was holding a printed sheet of paper, an appointment confirmation for a psychiatric evaluation. "Naomi, you need to go get tested," he said, his voice flat. I stared at the paper. In my previous life, he had used this exact same tactic. He used a forced psychiatric evaluation to prove I was suffering from postpartum psychosis, rendering all my accusations legally useless. Even after I was reassigned to the department in Charleston, that red flag had followed me in my files. Every promotion, every transfer, there was always someone asking, "Is it true you were mentally unstable back then?" I took the paper from his hand and ripped it to shreds right in front of them. "I'm not getting evaluated, right?" Wright's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Don't force my hand, Naomi." Lacey reached out to grab his arm. "Wright, stop. She's just grieving. She's in so much pain." I picked up a cup of cold tea from the table and poured it directly over Wright's expensive leather shoes. "Stop pretending to care," I spat. He grabbed my wrist, his grip like iron. Ignoring the pain, I turned my gaze to Lacey. "You love to cry, don't you? Let's hear it. Cry louder for everyone." Lacey shrank back under my stare, and the room erupted into angry shouts from my aunts and uncles. Wright dragged me toward the front door. "You are moving out of our apartment. Tonight." I let out a sharp laugh. "I bought that apartment before we even got engaged, right?" He froze. I pulled a copy of the deed from my purse and slapped it against the wall by the door. "From today on, if anyone catches Lacey inside my apartment, I'm filing breaking and entering charges." My father raised his hand to slap me, but before he could swing, there was a sharp knock at the door. A middle-aged woman wearing a worn gray trench coat stood on the porch. She looked past me into the living room, her eyes locking onto Lacey. She paused. "Are you Lacey Carter?" Lacey stepped back, instantly on guard. "Who are you?" The woman reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a faded photograph. "Your father owes my family a life. I've been looking for you for 17 years. Every eye in the room turned to Lacey. The crumpled tissue slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. The woman's voice was as cold as a winter gale, rattling the fine china sitting on my mother's mahogany sideboard. 17 years, the woman repeated, pulling a yellowed police report and a laminated newspaper clipping from her canvas bag. "My name is Martha Hayes. My husband was Officer David Hayes. 17 years ago, he was shot in the back, inside an abandoned warehouse on 4th Street. My father, Thomas Carter, went deathly pale. His hand, still half raised from when he had tried to slap me, froze in midair. "Madam," my father stammered, his authoritative voice suddenly thin and papery. "I don't know who you are, but you are trespassing in a private residence. Officer Hayes' death was investigated and closed by the department." "Closed?" Martha Hayes let out a harsh, dry laugh that sounded like scraping metal. She pointed a gnarled finger directly at Lacey, who was cowering behind. "Right. It was closed because you closed it, Inspector Carter. You signed off on the report claiming Arthur Miller, Lacey's father, was a brave civilian informant who died trying to shield my husband from smugglers." She threw the newspaper clipping onto the coffee table. The headline from nearly 2 decades ago stared back at the room in bold, faded black ink. "Local hero dies saving police officer in Port Amboy bust." "It was a lie," Martha hissed, her eyes burning with a dark, ancient fury. "Arthur Miller wasn't an informant. He was the head of the smuggling ring. Shot my husband to cover his escape, and when he crashed his getaway car 10 minutes later, you cooked the books, Thomas. You turned a cop killer into a martyr so the department wouldn't have to explain how $2 million in seized evidence vanished from the precinct vault." Silence fell over the living room, heavy, suffocating, and absolute. My aunt gasped, dropping her teacup. It shattered against the hardwood floor, dark amber liquid spreading across the rug like a stain. Lacey looked at my father, her eyes wide with sheer terror. "Uncle Thomas. She's lying, right? My dad was a hero. You told me he was a hero." My father didn't answer her. He couldn't. Sweat had broken out along his hairline, running down his temples into his collar. Wright stepped back from Lacey, his grip on her shoulder abruptly loosening. His sharp, analytical mind, the mind of a top corporate defense attorney, was already calculating the catastrophic legal and reputation risks. "Is this true, Thomas?" Wright asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. I stepped forward, picked up the yellowed police report from the table, and tapped the signature line at the bottom. "It is true. I said smoothly, looking at my father. Isn't it, Dad? That's why. You adopted Lacey 6 months after the incident. That's why you gave her everything, my room, my clothes, my college fund, my dignity. It wasn't out of charity. It was hush money paid to your own guilty conscience. Naomi, my mother shrieked, scrambling off the sofa, her face contorted in panic. Shut your mouth. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, I replied, pulling my phone from my coat pocket. I pressed play on an audio recording I had saved 3 days ago, a digitized copy of an old cassette tape from my father's locked study safe, a file I had spent years searching for in my previous life. My father's young, panicked voice echoed through the room speakers. The evidence locker is empty, Arthur. If Internal Affairs checks the seals, tomorrow, we're both going to federal prison. We take the girl, we bury the report, and we tell the press you died a hero. My mother stumbled backward, collapsing onto the sofa, her hands covering her face as she let out a choked, pathetic sob. Lacey backed away until her spine hit the wall. The saintly, fragile facade she had cultivated for 17 years cracked open, revealing the hollow, terrifying emptiness beneath. You, Lacey whispered, staring at my father. You made me a charity case for a lie? Miss Hayes, I turned to the woman in the trench coat, handing her a card with my personal attorney's contact information. The district attorney's internal affairs bureau has already reopened the 2007 Port Amboy file. They will be contacting you for a formal statement tomorrow morning at 9. Martha Hayes took the card, looked at my father one last time with utter contempt, turned on her heel, and walked out of the house, leaving the front door wide open to the howling wind outside. The fallout was swift, brutal, and mathematical. Within 48 hours of Martha Hayes' visit, the story leaked to the press. The local news channels ran the scandal on a continuous loop. Family of fallen hero accused of covering up cop-killing syndicate. My father was placed on administrative suspension from his retired pension board, his assets frozen pending an internal corruption review. My mother locked herself in her bedroom, refusing to answer calls from relatives who had once fawned over her saintly generosity. And Wright did exactly what a rat does when the ship takes on water. I sat in a quiet glass booth at an upscale cafe downtown, watching Wright walk in. He looked terrible. Dark circles were carved under his eyes, his expensive suit was rumpled, and he carried a heavy leather briefcase. He sat down across from me, setting a thick stack of papers on the table. I filed the paperwork to sever Lacey's legal guardianship from your parents' estate, Wright said, his voice flat and transactional. And I've instructed my firm to drop her representation in the defamation suit against the dance company. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. How noble of you, Wright. Sacrificing the golden girl to save your partnership. Wright's jaw tightened. I was lied to, Naomi. Just like you were. I had no idea Thomas was involved in police corruption, or that Lacey's background was fraudulent. I was just trying to protect what I thought was a grieving family. Protect? I let out a soft, mocking laugh. You held my arms while she poured red juice over my dress. You gave her my grandmother's magnolia brooch. You forced me to sign an abortion consent form because you thought her career was more important than my child's life. I didn't force you to sign it. Wright yelled, his voice cracking, drawing looks from nearby patrons. He lowered his voice, leaning across the table, his eyes desperate. Naomi, please, we can fix this. I've completely cut Lacey off. She's staying at a cheap motel near the interstate. I haven't answered her calls in 2 days. He reached out, trying to catch my hand, but I pulled my arm back, leaving his fingers hovering over the cold laminate table. I spoke to senior partners at my old firm, Wright pleaded, pulling a secondary document from his briefcase. They're willing to reinstate you as a senior litigation associate. Full partnership track. I'll give you 50% of my personal equity in the firm. We can start over, Naomi. We can have another baby. I looked at the document. Then I looked into his eyes, the eyes of the man who had watched me bleed in an operating room, the man who had texted me to put the past behind us while I was dying in a warehouse fire in another lifetime. Do you know why I signed that abortion paper, Wright? I asked softly. Wright blinked, taken aback. Because of the fake report? No, I smiled, a cold, beautiful, terrifying smile. I signed it because I realized that if that child had been born, he would have had your blood in his veins. And I would rather cut out my own heart than raise a monster like you. Wright went completely white. Naomi. I pulled out a sleek silver flash drive and set it beside his espresso cup. On this drive, I said smoothly, are the bank statements for the offshore escrow account you set up 3 years ago under Lacey's maiden name. The account you used to hide $200,000 in untaxed legal fees from your firm's managing partners. Wright's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the flash drive as if it were a coiled cobra. Where, how did you get that? I'm a very thorough researcher, I replied, standing up and buttoning my dark trench coat. I sent a copy to the State Bar Association Ethics Committee 10 minutes ago. Naomi. No. Wright scrambled out of his seat, knocking his chair over with a deafening crash, reaching for me frantically. You'll ruin me. I'll be disbarred. I'll lose my license. I looked down at him as he scrambled on the floor to pick up his fallen briefcase, his polished corporate facade entirely destroyed. You ruined yourself, Wright, I said calmly. I'm just delivering the mail. The Evergreen Dance Company was housed in a grand, historic theater in the Arts District. Tonight was supposed to be the opening night of their annual winter showcase, the night Lacey had spent 3 years preparing for, the night that was meant to launch her into national stardom as a principal ballerina. Instead, the lobby was a war zone of news cameras, furious ticket holders, and whispering dancers. I stood on the mezzanine balcony overlooking the grand foyer, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the drama unfold below. Lacey stood near the box office, wearing her white rehearsal tutu, a cheap coat thrown over her shoulders. She was weeping hysterically, grabbing the arm of the artistic director, Madame Laurent. Madam, please. Lacey sobbed, her voice echoing off the gilded walls. I've been rehearsing for 8 hours a day. You can't replace me now. The performance starts in 30 minutes. Madame Laurent, a stern French woman with steel gray hair, pulled her arm out of Lacey's grip with absolute revulsion. Replace you? Madame Laurent sneered, her voice carrying across the lobby. Miss Carter, or whatever your real name is, the Board of Trustees just reviewed the police documentation regarding your father's criminal history and your personal involvement in forging medical documents to blackmail a former donor. It wasn't me. It was a mistake. Lacey shrieked, her makeup running down her face in ugly gray tracks. My sister set me up. She's jealous of me. Your sister, Madame Laurent replied coldly, is currently funding our entire Youth Scholarship Foundation with the restitution money her lawyers reclaimed from your fraudulent trust fund. Security. 2 heavy-set theater guards stepped forward, grabbing Lacey by her upper arms. Get your hands off me. Lacey screamed, kicking her legs, her point shoes clattering against the marble floor. Right, where are you? Help me. She looked frantically around the lobby, searching the crowd for the man who had promised to protect her forever. She saw him. Wright was standing near the exit doors, flanked by 2 representatives from the State Bar Association who were serving him with an emergency license suspension notice. Lacey locked eyes with Wright, reaching a trembling, desperate hand toward him. Wright, tell them I'm your star. Wright didn't step forward. He didn't say a word. He turned his head away, pulled his collar up to hide his face from the cameras, and walked out the glass doors into the rain, leaving her behind without a second glance. The guards dragged Lacey out the side stage door, her shrieks fading into the cold evening air. I took a slow sip of my water, watching the stage crew pull down her oversized promotional poster from the foyer wall, tossing it into a rolling trash bin. In my previous life, she had stood on that stage under a golden spotlight, receiving armfuls of red roses while I sat in the back row, nursing bruised ribs and a broken heart. Tonight the stage was dark, and she was in the gutter. 3 weeks later, the winter storm hit the city, burying the streets in 6 inches of slush and gray ice. I sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Vance & Partners, the premier financial litigation firm in the state. Opposite me sat senior partner Marcus Vance, a formidable man in his 50s who had once been my mentor before I left the law to marry Wright. The criminal indictment against your father was handed down this morning, Naomi, Marcus said, sliding a legal brief across the desk to me. Tax evasion, obstruction of justice, and official misconduct. He's looking at 5 to 7 years in a federal facility. And my mother? I asked, scanning the pages. She surrendered the house to satisfy the civil lien filed by the police officer's widow, Marcus replied gently. She's moved into a small rental unit near her sister in Ohio. She tried calling my office yesterday, asking if you would accept a letter from her. I won't, I said smoothly. Marcus nodded, accepting my decision without judgment. He pulled out a secondary file. As for Wright, the Bar Association officially revoked his license to practice law yesterday. His firm ousted him, his assets have been seized to cover the civil fraud judgment, and he defaulted on his mortgage last Friday. Where is he? Living out of a residential motel by the docks, Marcus said, a faint trace of disgust in his tone. He's been trying to get a job as a paralegal, but no firm in the tri-state area will touch him with a 10-foot pole. I closed the folder and set it down on the desk. And Lacey? Lacey was arrested 48 hours ago, Marcus said, looking up into my Eyes. Not for the forgery, Naomi. For grand larceny. I raised an eyebrow. Lacey? Theft. It turns out she took $30,000 worth of vintage jewelry from your parents' master safe the night before the house was seized by the sheriff. Marcus explained. She tried to pawn it at a shop in South Jersey. The pawnbroker ran the serial numbers on the diamonds. They were registered under your mother's maiden name trust. Your mother personally pressed charges against her. A slow, quiet laugh escaped my lips. My mother, the woman who had spent 17 years putting Lacey on a pedestal, starving her biological daughter of affection to spoil her adopted angel, had finally cast her out the moment her precious diamonds were touched. There was no honor among thieves. And there was no loyalty among fake families. Naomi, Marcus said, leaning forward, resting his hands on the desk. The firm wants you back. Not as an associate. As a junior partner in our white-collar investigations division. You proved your instincts are sharper than anyone we've hired in a decade. I looked out the high glass window of the skyscraper at the snow falling over the city skyline. In my past life, I had died alone in a dark warehouse, choking on smoke, forgotten by a husband who was vacationing with his mistress. In this life, I held the pen. I wrote the verdicts. I accept, Marcus, I said, looking back at him with clear, steady eyes. On one condition. Name it. I take full control of the prosecution team assigned to the Port Amboy corruption trial. Marcus smiled, a sharp, razor-thin smile. Consider it done, partner. The rain fell in relentless sheets over the industrial canal, turning the gravel lot of the Blue Harbor Motel into a sea of murky puddles. A rusty sedan pulled up to room 108. Wright stepped out, holding a brown paper bag containing 2 cheap cans of soup and a cold sandwich. He was wearing an oversized, faded coat he had bought from a thrift shop, his shoes worn down at the heels, his hands red and cracked from the freezing rain. He unlocked the flimsy wooden door and stepped inside. The room smelled of damp carpets, stale tobacco, and mold. Sitting on the unmade bed, wearing a stained velour tracksuit, was Lacey. Her hair was unwashed, tangled, and dull. The delicate, graceful ballerina who had once captivated every man in the room was gone, replaced by a twitching, hollow shell of a woman with dark circles carved deep beneath her eyes. Did you get the money? Lacey rasped, snapping her head up as Wright walked in. Did your friend at the loan office give you the advance? Wright set the brown paper bag on the rickety laminate table, his face completely expressionless. No. He called security and had me escorted out of the building. You useless fool. Lacey shrieked, jumping off the bed and lunging toward him, snatching the paper bag. We need $12,000 for my criminal defense bail. The public defender told me if I go to trial on the grand larceny charge, I'm looking at 3 years in state prison. Wright didn't yell back. He didn't hit her. He just stood there, looking at her, with a dead, vacant gaze. 3 years, Wright whispered softly. That's nice, Lacey. Because my criminal hearing for corporate tax fraud is next month. I'm looking at 10. Lacey froze, holding the paper bag against her chest. Right, you have to call Naomi again. She loved you. She spent 6 years taking care of you. If you just get on your knees and tell her you made a mistake, she'll drop the civil suit. She'll give you the money. Wright let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He walked over to the cracked mirror above the sink and looked at his reflection. His hair was thinning. His skin was sallow. The sharp, charismatic defense attorney who had once owned a 4-bedroom penthouse and a sports car was gone. I tried, Lacey, Wright said, his voice trembling as tears finally spilled over his hollow cheeks. I waited outside her office building yesterday for 4 hours in the snow. Do you know what she did when she walked out? Lacey swallowed hard. What? She didn't even look at me, Wright choked out, bowing his head over the sink, his shoulders shaking with violent, pathetic sobs. She walked past me with 2 state investigators. She looked at me the exact same way she looks at a pile of dirty slush on the curb. She doesn't hate me, Lacey. She doesn't care if I live or die. Lacey dropped the paper bag onto the floor. The cans of soup rolled across the stained carpet, coming to a stop against the baseboard. We have nothing left, Lacey whispered, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated terror. No, Wright said, turning around to look at her with eyes full of pure, poisonous venom. I have nothing left. Because I traded a woman who gave me everything for a parasite who couldn't even draw her own blood. He walked over to the bed, grabbed his single duffel bag, and slung it over his shoulder. Right? What are you doing? Lacey panicked, running forward to grab his sleeve. Where are you going? You can't leave me here. I don't have enough money to pay for the room tonight. Wright yanked his arm out of her grip with such force that she stumbled backward, crashing heavily onto the cold floor. Pay with your trophies, Lacey, Wright spat, pushing open the door into the pouring rain. or go find another hero to save you. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him. Lacey lay on the cold, filthy carpet of the motel room, listening to the rain, pounding against the window panes, screaming his name into the empty, indifferent dark. 6 months later, the grand jury room of the federal district court was bathed in bright, clear, spring sunlight streaming through the tall arched windows. I stood at the prosecutor's podium, dressed in a sharp, dark navy suit, my hair styled in an elegant, sleek bun. On the desk before me lay the final case files for the state versus Thomas Carter and Wright Vance. Sitting at the defense table in orange prison jumpsuits were my father and Wright. My father looked decades older, his hair completely white, his shoulders stooped. As he sat between two public defenders, Wright sat beside him, his head bowed, his hands handcuffed to his waist chain. He hadn't raised his eyes to look at me once since the trial began 3 days ago. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I spoke, my voice calm, steady, and resonant, echoing through the high-ceilinged courtroom. Justice is often pictured as a blind goddess holding scales. But justice is not blind to truth. It only waits for those who have been wronged to stand up and speak. I turned my gaze toward the defense table. For 17 years, the defendants believed that a lie, if repeated often enough and backed by authority, could replace reality. They believed they could bury a murder, steal a child's inheritance, and destroy an innocent life without ever paying the cost. I picked up the final piece of evidence, the original silver magnolia brooch, which police had recovered from Lacey's pawned belongings. I set it down on the evidence table in front of the jury box. Today, I said quietly, the debt is settled. The jury reached their verdict in less than 45 minutes. Thomas Carter, guilty on all counts of official corruption, evidence tampering, and perjury, sentenced to 8 years in federal penitentiary. Wright Vance, guilty of corporate fraud, tax evasion, and accessory to evidence tampering, sentenced to 6 years without parole eligibility. When the judge slammed his gavel down, the courtroom erupted into hushed chatter. I gathered my files, slid them into my leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches shut. As the bailiff stepped forward to lead the prisoners out through the side door, Wright suddenly stopped. He turned his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine through the crowd of reporters and attorneys. Naomi, he rasped, his voice barely audible over the noise of the room. Naomi, please. I met his gaze for a single, quiet second. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. My heart didn't beat a single fraction faster. I simply picked up my briefcase, turned my back on him, and walked out the grand double doors into the sunlit corridor. Epilogue, a clear horizon. Spring in the city arrived with a gentle, blooming warmth. I walked out onto the high stone balcony of my new penthouse apartment, overlooking the river. The city stretched out beneath me, glowing golden under the late afternoon sun. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the faint scent of blooming jasmine. From the terrace garden, my assistant, a sharp young law clerk named Clara, stepped onto the balcony, holding a tray with a warm cup of Earl Grey tea and the evening paper. The final liquidation of the Carter estate was completed this morning, Miss Vance, Clara reported smoothly. The remaining funds have been transferred directly to the Officer Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund, as you directed. Thank you, Clara. I smiled, taking the teacup into my hands. And Miss Carter, Lacey, Clara added carefully. She was sentenced to 24 months at the Regional Correctional Facility this morning after pleading guilty to grand larceny. I looked out over the river, watching a ferry glide smoothly across the blue water. How is she? I asked softly. Her public defender said she doesn't speak much anymore, Clara replied. She just sits in her cell, practicing ballet positions in her mind. I took a slow sip of my tea. The warmth spread through my chest, light and unburdened. The nightmare of 10 years, the cold operating room, the fake reports, the burning warehouse, the sound of rain against a motel window, had finally been washed away by the tide. I pulled off the small square of sterile tape I had worn over the inner crook of my elbow for weeks, the last physical mark from the hospital. Underneath, the skin was smooth, clear, and completely healed. Will you be attending the Bar Association Gala tonight, partner? Clara asked. Warmly, I looked up at the sky, where the first stars of the evening were beginning to twinkle against the deep blue horizon. Yes, I said, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across my face, a smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I have a long night ahead of me, and a whole lifetime to live.